Shalom, Lord in Christ. I'm Priest and Officer Ashar Gapan of the Israelite School of Universal Practical Knowledge, started out of 1 West, 125th Street, Harlem, New York. And since 1969, we have been teaching the truth according to the Bible. And that is by declaring and proving that the so-called Negroes, so-called Hispanics, and Native Americans, that we are the real children of God, that we are the descendants of what people called the Israelites in the Bible. And today is the ISUPK's history class every Monday at 7 p.m., even though we're starting a little bit later today. All around the country, every zone will be teaching history today. And today, we're going to piggyback off of class from last Monday, which was based on the Irish and the St. Patrick's Day parade. We touched upon last Monday's class on the New York City Draft Riots, and I thought it would be wise to dig a little bit deeper, dive more into the New York City Draft Riots, the causes, what happened, the outcome. And for that, what we're going to do is there's a great documentary that we watched earlier that was on the History Channel. And you all know me, I'm a big fan of the History Channel since I was a kid. This video is actually very informative and also entertaining by keeping your interest in the subject matter. So what we're going to do, Pratiza, I would like for you to please share the YouTube link.
Okay. Oh, you want this one
right there? Perfect. Now you can expand it. Nope, stay there and just expand it. Go back to StreamYard, please. And what we're gonna do? Yep, you can leave it right there.
Nope. Right there.
Nope. Right there. We're gonna leave it right there for right now. And I would like to encourage everyone. Sit back, relax, take out your notebooks. There's gonna be a lot of historical information here that will be important for you to know about the New York City Draft Riots. Please, let's play this.
Yes, sir.
Stories from the pages of time. Stories of triumph and tragedy, adventure and achievement, as we go in search of history. In 1863, as our nation struggles through a third year of civil war, New York erupts in civil insurrection, the deadliest riots in American history. As an angry mob faces police and federal troops, blood flows in the streets and the city teeters on the brink of revolution. The turmoil is fueled by fiery politics and racial tension. African Americans are lynched, homes are burned, businesses looted. As we go in search of history, we'll uncover this forgotten story. The Civil War Draft Riots.
Go back to StreamYard and just hit the next tab right there.
This one right?
No, the one to the left. Okay, so just to give everyone some background information, as we're soon about to learn, the New York City Draft Riots happened in 1863 in July here in New York City. This was during the time of the Civil War between North and South, due to what many people would argue, due to slavery, due to how slavery was greatly intertwined with politics and the economic system here in America. And the Civil War was fought between some of the southern states that wanted to or did succeed or leave the Union, which broke apart the union that was created of the multiple states that were established throughout the history of this government here in America. And so the North and South went and fought against each other. And what we are about to witness is the who, what, where, when, why, the how it happened, as we start rolling this tape again. So you can leave it right here in this setting and just press play on the YouTube, all right?
Okay.
In the 1960s, the United States is embroiled in an unpopular war in Vietnam. Many young men refuse to submit to the draft. As they take their opposition to the streets, demonstrations sometimes turn violent. But this is not the first time draft resistance has escalated into urban conflict. More than 100 years earlier, in the midst of the Civil War, violent protest against conscription throws New York City into chaos.
This was by
So here in New York City, Abraham Lincoln and Congress had pushed to pass the Conscription Act of 1863. And what this did, the effect of this created one of the biggest violence, one of the biggest periods of violence in America by Americans or people that were living here in this country against its own people. It was the Conscription Act of 1863 put the wealthy against the poor, put the poor against slaves or freed black people. It caused an all-out war here in the streets of Manhattan, especially in the downtown areas, where people were being unalived, homes were being burned to the ground, the wealthy were being attacked, police were being attacked, buildings that were set up for headquarters for voting and for the draft were being burned down, telephone wires were being cut. It was just complete mayhem of what was happening due to the Conscription Act of 1863. Keep going.
far the largest riot in American history. You might say it's the largest civil insurrection in American history, other than the South's rebellion itself.
Thousands of rioters, many of them Irish immigrants, square off against police and federal troops in desperate street battles. For 5 terrifying days, New York is in the hands of the mob. What has provoked such an outburst of fury? The causes can be found in the social life and politics of the city itself. In the decades before the Civil War, New York City is the greatest urban center in America. It leads the nation in manufacturing, trade, and finance. Between 1800 and 1860, its population grows by more than 1,000%. 800,000 people are packed onto the small island of Manhattan.
The density of the population meant that in some parts of the city, like 5 Points, which is the area just north of the present City Hall, and approximately 2/3 of a square mile had 40,000 people.
Well,
someone said you breathe.
So I hope everyone was paying very close attention, because here in public school education system, we're taught that the North wanted to abolish slavery, right? Which is not entirely true. There were many members that lived in the North that had political power, economic power, that did not want to abolish slavery. They were anti the abolishment of slavery, and they also sided with the South. We have to keep in mind that the North was very industrialized. You had a lot of industrial businesses, whether it was textile factories, mills, everything, where the raw material to make these items like pants and shirts and making flour, or so let's just say cereal, every manufacturing place was up here in the North, and all the raw material was acquired from the South. Now, the South's way of life, they had some estimate anywhere to $1 to $5 billion that were invested in the South's way of life based on free slave labor. Anything from tobacco to cotton, sugarcane, food, all of that came from the South and was done primarily off of slave labor. Now, the raw materials that were produced due to the slave labor were shipped to the North, where the North, these places and facilities and businesses used it to create the goods that everyone was using. I believe about 40% of the goods that were made were from raw materials from the South. Now, this is shipping everything from all across the world to even being purchased domestically. So many businesses, politicians in the North were sided with the South, and there were even threats about New York seceding from the Union because of how tightly bound the New York City was to the South. Keep going.
Come.
Even you knock someone over.
European visitors to New York would comment on the jostling that took place on, say, Broadway between a poor washerwoman and a wealthy banker or merchant, the kind of close proximity of bodies and of contact.
Much of the city's growth is the result of immigration. As the nation's greatest port, it's a natural gathering point for new arrivals. Many of them remain in the city to find a place within its cultural mosaic.
We tend to think of New York as a center, but in many ways, New York was a kind of frontier, too. It was a place of clashing cultures, fresh contacts between different kinds of people who hadn't encountered each other before.
On the eve of the Civil War, half the city's population is foreign-born, and half of these immigrants are Irish, making New York the world's largest Irish city. Most are recent arrivals, refugees from the potato famine. With few marketable skills, they end up in the lowest-paying jobs as dock workers and laborers, if they are lucky enough to find employment at all. What's worse, they face rampant discrimination in their new land. Advertisements for jobs frequently carry the warning, Irish need not apply.
It was a great deal of it.
So here in America, the Irish were the bottom of the barrel when it comes to white people. You know how we can say that the Jewish man is the creme de la creme of white people. You know, they're right there on top. The Irish were at the what do you call them? The rungs, the bottom of the barrel.
Bottom of the barrel.
No one wants to drink the bottom of the barrel wine because it has all that stuff still in it. You know, they were the bottom. They were the bottom of the bottom, the worst of the worst, and they were treated very poorly by their fellow other white folks, white men. All right, keep going.
Anti-Catholic prejudice in the city. There was a feeling that the Irish somehow would be disloyal to the American political system, that they owed their allegiance to Rome rather than to anything else. There was a feeling that they were, by dint of their very poverty, somehow depraved, drunken, unable to be true American citizens.
They make up for the persecution by carving out their own place in the city, establishing neighborhood taverns and greengrocers, and joining volunteer fire companies. One group, the Democratic Party, welcomes the Irish with open arms.
For the Democrats, it meant votes. For the Irish, the Democrats meant a hand to try and grab onto to really get somewhere in the New World.
But ethnic conflict and poverty often lead to civic unrest. Urban life in those days is prone to frequent outbreaks of violence.
There were plenty of riots in New York City in the 19th century. It was a very violent city. There were bread riots and election riots and anti-immigrant riots in the 1830s and 40s.
The streets of New York are often battlefields, and sometimes the streets themselves are used as weapons.
The rocks or the stones that we use to construct streets, they became known as Irish confetti. Dissident Irish would dig these up when they were trying to make a point, put them into a sling, and let them fly.
So just to summarize what they're saying is that the Irish are very violent. White people in general, as we're seeing just by looking at the Civil War, white people are very violent. You had the North filled with white people. going to war against the South, filled with white people, and they were unaliving each other. If I'm not mistaken, the Civil War was the biggest war the Civil War had the most white American casualties out of any war that America has been in. Because you had American citizens, free men who were white, fighting each other and going to war with each other and unaliving each other. And here we're seeing how violent the Irish were in New York City during this period, because they, of course, were at the bottom of society and they were fighting amongst their brethren, the Germans, the other Englishmen that were here, trying to grab hold of some type of respect and honor and power and position here in America. Keep going.
Okay.
So things were fairly chaotic in this burgeoning New York, and the only thing that kept the various conflicting groups from attacking the establishment is that they hated one another even more. And all of the groups, of course, had as a negative reference group the Africans.
Since 1827, when slaves were emancipated in New York,
Press the back arrow. Press the back arrows on the keyboard. The back arrows to your right, next to the numbers.
All right.
Press it 2 times. One more. Just physically rewind it back like 10 seconds. Or
10 seconds? Okay.
Yeah. Bring it to 6:15. Right there. Now listen very closly. Play it.
Various conflicting groups from attacking the establishment is that they hated one another even more. And all of the groups, of course, had as a negative reference group the Africans.
And all the groups, every group of white people did not like the African Americans, whether they were free or slaves. They were against us. Keep going.
Okay.
since 1827, when slaves were emancipated in New York, some African Americans have risen to middle-class status, but the majority remain on the bottom rungs of the New York economy.
Most of the blacks in the city were poor, working men, laborers of one kind or another, usually unskilled, in part because white artisans did not think much of having black men working beside them.
Ironically, many Irish immigrants view blacks as a threat, since both groups compete for the same low-paying positions. They fear that black laborers will steal their jobs and jeopardize their place in New York society.
Kind of like how now they've been saying for years how the Mexicans or the Spanish immigrants are going to take the jobs of hardworking Americans, which is not true at all. Here, the Irish, white people, feared that black people were going to take their jobs because the Irish were the poorest of the poorest of the whites. They weren't that skilled in many things, and their only competition that they would see as a threat were the freed black people living in New York City that also were going for the same jobs they were going for. Keep going.
There had been a couple of instances in New York and other places where blacks were used to break strikes. But in fact, the idea that blacks were going to compete with whites for jobs was totally ludicrous. In fact, what had happened in New York City before this was that whites had taken away all the jobs of blacks. So the Irish were very racist, but it wasn't just inborn in them genetically or something. It was because of the particular circumstances that they found when they came to New York.
To an extent, the one thing that they had in common with their social betters
that they found when they came to. So the Irish were very racist, but there had been a couple of instances in New York and other places where blacks were used to break strikes. But in fact, the idea that blacks were going to compete with whites for jobs was totally ludicrous. In fact, what had happened in New York City before this was that whites had taken away all the jobs of blacks. So the Irish were very racist, but it wasn't just inborn in them genetically or something. It was because of the particular circumstances that they found when they came to New York.
To an extent,
The Irish
the
were
one thing that they had in common with
Keep going.
their social betters was the color of their skin. And that gave them, in a sense, a privilege in their own minds. And for some Irish Americans, not all by any means, for some Irish privilege in theirs was the color of their skin. And that was the color
that they found when they came to New York.
To an extent, the one thing that they had in common with their social betters was the color of their skin. And that gave them, in a sense, a privilege in their own minds. And for some Irish Americans, not all by any means, the presence of blacks was the presence of the very group that they had to stand above.
So because of the color of their skin, Irishmen knew that they were still better than African Americans to themselves, because even though we are the poorest of the poor of whites, we are still whites and we're still better than African Americans. That's the mindset that they had then, and it's still the mindset that lower class whites have today. When people from Ukraine come over here, they know that they're still better than African Americans and Latinos because they're white. When people from Bosnia and Greece come over here, they know that they're still better than African Americans because they're white. They know they're better than Hispanics because they're still white. They can be at the bottom of white society and still be better than the top of the black society.
That's right.
Keep going.
Come. Oh, Salaki, sir.
Right.
And also, he said not all Irish people thought this way, but the majority thought this way. You know, he tried to clean it up. It was all of them.
Yeah.
Though there is intense competition among New York's ethnic groups, the city as a whole is prospering in 1860. But now, as war looms on the horizon, New York's prosperity seems to be in jeopardy. The problem is the city's dependence on trade with the southern states.
Most of the cotton shipped out of the South passed through New York City or was shipped by New York City ships. Large number of the working people in New York derived their living from slavery and from the marketing of the cotton crops.
In January 1860, the Democratic mayor Fernando Wood actually proposes that New York should secede from the Union in order to maintain.
This is what I was saying earlier. New York City was doing so much business with the South that New York City could not afford to get rid of slavery because they relied so much on the slavery of the South. Even the mayor of New York City at the time, who we are about to listen to or learn about, he even suggested that New York City should remove itself and from the Union and align itself with the South. Keep going.
Okay.
Maintain its profitable connection with the South. Nothing comes of the plan, but it indicates the depth of such sentiments.
If you wanted to find the most pro-Southern, anti-black elements in New York City politics and the Democratic Party, they were the followers of Fernando Wood.
There was a great deal of anxiety from the beginning of the war whether New York would stay with the Union enthusiastically. So it came as an enormous relief to the Lincoln administration when on April 20th, 1861, thousands of people gathered in Union Square to announce after the firing on Fort Sumter their support of the Union.
The Irish may be loyal to Fernando Wood and the Democrats, but once the Civil War begins, they are as patriotic as anyone else. They even form their own regiments.
Southern secession gave the immigrants a chance to display their patriotism. And it allowed them at once to show that they were brave and manly and so forth, but to also show that they intended to be good Americans. They weren't disloyal. They didn't have their hearts back home or with the Pope in Rome or somewhere. They were good Americans.
But in spite of their initial enthusiasm, many Irish New Yorkers will grow weary of the war over the next 2 years, and their bitterness will lead to violence in the draft riot.
So just to make everyone aware, the Irish created their own militias. The Irish also joined the Civil War and fought on the side of the North against the South. Okay, keep going.
Okay.
Riots. By late 1862, the Civil War has been dragging on longer than anyone expected, and it isn't going well for the North. Union forces are making uncertain progress on the battlefield. It's a bloody conflict, draining the nation of resources and men. Support for the war is beginning to fade when Lincoln announces a startling new plan. He'll issue a presidential decree to free the slaves.
It was a military measure. It was not a moral imperative that motivated the Emancipation
Was it?
Proclamation.
Rewind it. Play it in the back for the Christian pastors and all these blackety black folks and white people who like to argue that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves because it was wrong. No. Listen to these college professors and historians tell you the motive behind Abraham Lincoln's decision to free the slaves. Play it.
He'll issue a presidential decree to free the slaves.
It was a military measure. It was not a moral imperative that motivated the Emancipation Proclamation.
Pause it. It had nothing to do with being morally just, morally right. If it was up to Abraham Lincoln, if the war could have ended, they would have. If the war would have ended earlier in 1862, there would still be slaves. He would never have came out with the Emancipation Proclamation. Black people and Native Americans would still be slaves here in America. It wasn't because it was morally wrong. It was just a military strategy. It was a military strategic move on behalf of the Union and Abraham Lincoln to free the slaves. Go ahead, Protestant.
And if I may, that's how they got the slave the black brothers who escaped from slavery to the North and joined the Union Army.
Yeah.
So they could have more numbers on their side. So that's why they say any escaped slave make it to the North, you'll be able to join the army to fight against the South.
That's
That's why
absolutely
they
correct.
got extra numbers.
Now, just to be clear, free black people in the North were not required to enlist in the draft. They weren't required to enlist in the army, right? So this was another reason that the Irish had so much beef and issue with having to go to war, because they thought in their minds the war was to free black people.
That's right.
All right, keep going.
Come on.
Lincoln's strategy in the Emancipation Proclamation was to destroy the economic foundation of the South.
The proclamation doesn't actually free all the slaves, only those who are in Confederate territory, some 3 million in all.
The Emancipation Proclamation did not free all the slaves. It just freed the slaves in the South. It was to further incite violence and war and try to overturn the battle that the North was having with the South. Again, it was just a military strategy that the North came up with in their effort to win the war with the South. Keep going.
Oh, God.
It excludes nearly 1 million slaves in the border states loyal to the Union and in those areas under military occupation.
The significance of the Emancipation Proclamation is not simply in that act alone, but that it, for the first time, made emancipation officially the policy of the Union. So it really transformed the nature of the war. It meant that it was no longer a war of army against army, but of society against society, and that if the Union won, there was going to be a social revolution in the South.
For many in the North, however, news of the Emancipation Proclamation will further erode enthusiasm for the war.
Many Irish workers were not pleased, to say the least, with the Emancipation Proclamation because they feared that It would unleash a flood of black people into the North from the South to compete for jobs, to compete for housing. And now that the war's purpose had changed, they became very bitterly estranged from the Lincoln administration.
Many of them begin to feel, as the cause of emancipation is more publicly pursued by the Lincoln administration, that they've been hoodwinked, that the cause that they were fighting for is shifting under their feet.
Listen, the Irish don't love you black people. The Irish don't love you Native Americans. The Irish doesn't love you so-called Hispanics. Don't believe any of this garbage where there were some white people that befriended blacks and Native Americans. Yeah, okay. But the Irish went to war to prove how much of an American they were and how loyal they were to this country. And as soon as the politics of the war switched to free, we got to free these slaves from the South. As soon as the politics switched up, the Irish was like, nope, that's not why we fought in this Civil War. That's not why we sent our sons and fathers and uncles and dads to free slaves who are only going to give us more competition in the workforce up here. They weren't having that.
Right.
Keep going.
Meanwhile, the Union Army badly needs more men. Casualties and desertions have thinned the ranks, and fewer men are enlisting.
Well, Abraham Lincoln had called for 300,000 more volunteers in 1862, which even at that moment seemed like an incredible demand.
And when the volunteers began to think twice and three times, and efforts had to be made to find some way of persuading them to serve. How do you maintain an army where more and more the conviction is spreading that to serve is suicidal?
The federal government has set enlistment quotas for the states, and they do their best to meet the demand. Most states offer a cash bounty to encourage volunteers. A bonus of several $100s can stimulate patriotism as well as greed.
There were people who made a profession of enlisting to get their bounty and then deserting to go to another location where they could pick up another bounty. American entrepreneurship.
But by early 1863, even cold, hard cash isn't enough of an incentive. On March 5th, Congress passes a Conscription Act. For the first time, the federal government will draft men into the Army. It's a controversial measure, inspiring heated debate, in part because it contains a loophole. Any draftee can be exempted if he pays $300 to the government or furnishes a hired substitute.
This was absolutely direct. If you had $300 in your pocket, you could get out of the draft. Now, in 1863, $300 was more than the average annual wage for a New York City laborer. So this conscription law seemed to be telling the ordinary laborers in no uncertain terms, well, from now on, this is going to be a rich man's war and a poor man's fight.
Many Irish New Yorkers could barely feed their family, and there was no such thing as Social Security or welfare at the time, and they were the sole breadwinners. And now the sole breadwinner for a family barely able to eke out an existence is being called upon to go south and fight the Confederates.
Yeah, don't feel too bad because black people and Native Americans were tortured here in the Americas, were forcibly removed from their land in the most harsh manners. Black children were fed to alligators. People who wanted freedom were hunted down like wild hogs were being hunted. So don't feel too bad that for, a small period of time, it was a little rough for them. It was immensely rougher for the centuries of enslavement for natives and African Americans here in this country. Keep going.
You're not just asking people to serve, you're forcing people to serve. And you are granting exemptions, adding insult to injury. You're granting exemptions to those people who can afford to pay for those exemptions, flew in the face of everything that people had been taught about American democracy. So the anger was understandably real, and the level of violence already being high. All it took was a provocation like the draft lottery to set it off. This was the last straw to many of the New Yorkers.
One working man writes a letter to the New York Times in which he voices his protest. That $300 has made us nobodies, vagabonds, and cast-outs of society. We are the poor rabble, and the rich rabble is our enemy by this law. Still, there is no sign yet of overt resistance, and New York's Democratic politicians reassure their constituents that there is nothing to worry about.
They had been promised by the governor, their governor, Horatio Seymour, that the draft was unconstitutional, that it would be challenged in the courts. Many New Yorkers had a wait-and-see attitude towards federal conscription.
But the war won't wait. With New York's first draft lottery scheduled for July 11th, President Lincoln considers placing troops in the city to prevent trouble. But he's afraid it might simply inflame public opinion. And besides, all available troops are needed at the front lines. The war has taken an ominous turn as General Lee and his Confederate Army invade Union territory.
Lee managed to get into Pennsylvania. He was headed towards Harrisburg, from which he could make a pretty good straight line to capture Washington. So stopping Lee's advance was absolutely crucial.
In the first days of July at Gettysburg, Lee's advance is stopped. But as the Union victory is celebrated, the wounded pour into New York City's hospitals, and lists of the dead are printed in the newspapers. As the date for the draft approaches, the war seems closer than ever. Saturday, July 11th. The draft lottery begins in New York at 9 a.m. in the 9th District office at 46th Street and 3rd Avenue. Over the next few hours, more than 1,200 names are drawn, many of them Irish. At the end of the day, the lottery is adjourned peacefully until Monday morning. But as workers gather in their kitchens and neighborhood bars, the draft is on their minds. The weekend break will give their anger time to build.
The taverns had very close connections to political organizations, political clubs. They were spots for political discussion, very often fueled by intoxicants. That mixture became quite volatile, particularly given the fact that the draft began on a Saturday.
Saturday night, people had a chance to drink and talk about what they were going to do on Monday. They had 24 hours of planning that Sunday.
Word spreads quickly through the community, and on Monday morning, workers march uptown for a rally near Central Park. Then they head to the draft office, where the drawing is scheduled to resume. In the vanguard of the protest are volunteer firemen. They have traditionally been exempt from militia duty, and now they demand to be excused from the draft. The names of several firemen were selected on Saturday, but today they'll see to it that no one else is called. They know how to set fires as well as put them out. In minutes, the draft office is engulfed in flames, and soon the entire block is in ruins.
Look at how violent they are. When white people don't get their way, they become violent. Keep going.
Come on.
Urgent messages reach police headquarters on Mulberry Street, and Superintendent John Kennedy heads uptown for a first-hand look. Stepping from his carriage, he is surrounded by rioters who beat him viciously and leave him for dead. Kennedy survives, but he'll remain bedridden for the rest of the week. Now the police commissioner, Thomas Acton, takes over. He has only 800 men on duty to fend off a mob that will soon number 50,000. The insurrection has come at a particularly bad time. The city is virtually defenseless, with troops and National Guard units still at the front in Pennsylvania. As they realize the extent of the threat, the authorities summon every armed man they can find. Police from Brooklyn, Marines from the Navy Yard, guards from the harbor forts, just a few hundred men in all. But in spite of the odds, Acton insists on striking back. Throughout the week, the police respond ruthlessly, despite the fact that they, like many of the rioters, are Irish. As the day progresses, the situation deteriorates. This is no longer just a protest against the draft. It is becoming a full-blown assault on all authority. Railroad tracks and telegraph lines are torn up. Police and well-dressed gentlemen are assaulted.
The rioters attacked the homes of those people who supported abolition. It's not a question of how much money you had, it's a question of whether you were a Republican or a Democrat. Well, the rioters roamed the streets, attacking visible signs of Republican Party support, like the gas works and factories owned by prominent Republicans. They went after their homes, they ransacked the homes.
Republican newspapers are also targets. Across the park from City Hall, the New York Tribune is invaded. The police counterattack, pushing back the mob. By Monday afternoon, the rioters turn their attentions to new targets, African Americans.
What was it? So now that they're fighting each other, they're unaliving other white people. They're burning down the businesses and houses of other white people. Now we're going to get into the root of their hatred. Because remember, the Irish were the bottom of the barrel of white people. The Irish looked and viewed African Americans as a threat to their livelihood and security here in this country. Right. The Irish joined the North's cause for the Civil War to prove how patriotic they were to America, and were severely disgusted and had a great sense of betrayal when Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. They were betrayed because now the war took the angle of fighting to free black people, and the Irish viewed black people as a threat to their way of life. And here we are about to get into what the Irish did during the New York City Draft Riots to the very people that they hated, which was black people. Go ahead.
The riot was mostly indiscriminate, and any black person who happened to have the bad luck of being out on the streets would find himself assaulted, often lynched.
Bloodthirsty mobs roam the city, searching for innocent black victims. Near the waterfront, they seize one man returning from the bakery with a loaf of bread. He's beaten, and then he's hanged. Finally, the crowd sets fire to his body. They seem bent on wiping out a community they view as the source of all their problems.
Was it?
Somehow
they view the black community as the source of all their problems. Keep going.
Oh, God.
How blacks became symbols of the entire war effort. The idea was, well, if there weren't any blacks in America, there wouldn't have been a war. Blacks are benefiting from the war.
One of the most shocking episodes of racial violence is an attack on a black orphanage, the Orphan Asylum for Colored Children. One account describes the rioters clamoring around the house like demons. They break down the doors with axes, while 230 orphans and their teachers barely escape with their lives. The mob strips the orphanage bare, carrying away everything that isn't nailed down. By Monday night, much of the city is in chaos. Tuesday, July 14th, New York City is paralyzed. A second day of rioting brings more street battles as factories and armories come under attack.
What's amazing, though, by Tuesday of the riot week is just how ferocious these conflicts were, the fury of those struggles.
Looking for weapons, a mob invades the Union Steamworks at 22nd Street, where government munitions are stored. They manage to occupy the building before it is retaken by police floor by floor. In another battle at 34th Street, snipers pick off the police with guns and bricks. Finally, troops arrive under the command of Colonel Henry O'Brien. The tide turns, and rioters fall by the score. When O'Brien returns to his home a few blocks away, he's spotted by a crowd. They drag him through the streets and beat him to death, pausing only to allow a priest to administer last rites. Like many riots, this one becomes an excuse for looting. Downtown on Christie Street, employees of Lord & Taylor defend their store with guns. But at the Brooks Brothers clothing store, the mob breaks in and they help themselves to stacks of merchandise. Across the city, dozens of buildings have been set on fire, and courageous firemen are now battling the blazes, as well as the rioters.
The fire companies actually turned around, in effect, and became active in trying to restore order to the city. They were absolutely courageous. There were scenes during the draft riots of fire companies going to police stations that had been under attack, going to various sites that had been under attack, and putting out the fires that, in some cases, their friends and neighbors may have helped set.
On Tuesday afternoon, a black tenement on Roosevelt Street is burned to the ground. Over the next few days, there will be more assaults on African Americans. Men, women, even children are beaten or lynched. These victims have nothing in common but the color of their skin.
If you were black, it was just like you had no right to exist in the eyes of these rioters.
As the rioting intensifies, there are rumors that it's being encouraged by the Confederates. And it seems likely that there are at least a few Southern agents in the city, men like John Andrews, who was often spotted inciting the mob. Republican newspapers like the New York Times are convinced that the violence is the result of outside agitation.
We have no doubt that there are agents direct from Richmond now in this city who are using energy and money to feed the flames that have reddened the sky of New York.
But today, most historians are not so sure that the violence was actually organized by the Confederacy or by anyone else.
The rioters had their informal forms of organization. It's not as if there was a grand conspiracy that had been hatched to defeat the draft, although there was talk that there were various Southern agents floating through the city who were going to try and take advantage of the situation and try and stir up trouble.
Certainly there was plenty of pro-Southern sentiment among the rioters themselves. They didn't need to have their strings pulled. The riots seemed to be swirling, spontaneous, neighborhood-based.
On Tuesday, Democratic New York Governor Horatio Seymour comes to the city from his vacation home on the New Jersey shore to try to calm things down. At noon, he addresses a crowd from the steps of City Hall.
My friends, I have sent my adjutant general to Washington to confer with the authorities there and to have this draft suspended. I will do all that I can to see that there is.
Make that picture bigger. Switch the screen.
Okay.
So you have about 3 black people hanging from the tree. Go to the YouTube video.
Okay.
Right? You got about like 3 people hanging from 3 black people hanging from the tree. Right underneath the guy with his arm out waving, a white man is holding the head of a black man. You see that? This is what the Irish did. because the Irish saw how other white people were treating black people here in the Americas since they've been here. So they just followed the same thing. Everyone here in America was against black people. That's why the Irish felt that it was okay and within their power to do this to black people. Keep going.
There's no inequality and no wrong done to anyone.
With his tone of appeasement, the governor seems to be giving in to the rioters' demands. His speech draws a storm of criticism.
That speech did not help matters at all. I, for one, think that Seymour was sincere in his attempt to try and calm things down. I don't think that Seymour was the great Satan that some Republicans made him out to be, but I don't think he was effective in doing what he set out to do.
There are two very different strategies of how to rule a city, how to govern a mob. One is Seymour's, and that is this friendly approach, my friends. The other approach is that of the police commissioner, Acton, a number of Republican leaders who are in contact with Lincoln's government, which is that martial law should be declared.
But President Lincoln decides that declaring martial law could further inflame the situation, so matters are left in the hands of the New York authorities. On Wednesday morning, the city's Board of Aldermen and Common Council pass an emergency ordinance proposed by the Democrats. They appropriate $2.5 million to pay the exemptions for every New Yorker who is drafted.
The Common Council's Act, in the minds of some people, is just a kind of yielding to extortion. And the issue of fiscal irresponsibility, who was going to track those dollars, was one that in the desperation of this particular moment, people didn't think too much about.
While government leaders try to defuse the situation, riots still rage across the city. Late Wednesday afternoon, a mob of 10,000 gathers near the fashionable homes of Gramercy and Stuyvesant Squares at 19th Street and First Avenue. They are met by a small infantry detachment and an artillery unit commanded by Colonel Edward Jardine. After snipers cut the troops to pieces, the soldiers flee, leaving behind their dead and wounded, including Colonel Jardine, who has been struck in the leg by a bullet. The colonel is helped by two of his men to a house on East 19th Street, where a woman ushers them inside. Jardine and one of the men are hidden in the cellar. The other soldier is taken to the attic. They can hear the rioters outside making their way down the street, looting houses and searching for hidden soldiers. The sounds of fists beating on the front door signal their arrival. Pushing their way inside, they quickly find Jardine and his companion in the cellar. He begs them to fetch a Catholic priest before they shoot him, and the rioters seem to relent. They let him live and leave the house without bothering to search upstairs. While New York City is being torn apart, protests flare up elsewhere in the North, from Ohio to Massachusetts, but none compares to the New York riots.
Well, the New York City Draft Riot was by far the largest, most violent example of resistance to the draft in the North.
It's clear that there might well have been draft rioting in other cities if the federal government hadn't acted quickly. There is a show of federal force in Philadelphia by the middle of the week of July 13th that might well have prevented a putative draft riot there. And there is an anti-draft riot in Boston, which was not on the scale of New York City, but was still worrisome to Lincoln's administration.
In the Confederacy, President Jefferson Davis and his supporters view the riots as a hopeful sign. The Richmond Dispatch sounds a triumphant note.
The red battle flag now waves in New York over streets wet with the gore of Lincoln's hated minions.
Many Confederate leaders were delighted, not just for political reasons, but also for ideological reasons. It seemed to show the rotten nature of Northern society, which was the point that they had been making all along.
Meanwhile, in the wake of Gettysburg, Robert E. Lee and his defeated Confederate Army finally make their way across the Potomac River, escaping to the safety of Virginia. Now, federal troops are available to put down the riots. Before dawn on Thursday, July 16th, 2 regiments of the New York National Guard return to the city from Gettysburg. Thousands more troops will follow over the next few days. But on that Thursday afternoon, the rioters make a last stand on the East Side in one of the bloodiest battles of the week. A crowd of 5,000 holds troops at bay, killing 15 of them before reinforcements arrive to clear the streets with bullets and bayonets. At noon on Friday, the Catholic Archbishop of New York, John Hughes, addresses the rioters from the balcony of his home on Madison Avenue. Soldiers remain on the sidelines, close at hand if they are needed.
The rioting really met a turning point when Hughes himself put his, not simply his reputation, but his body on the line, addressing the rioters, telling them to desist.
Like them, he opposes the draft, but in America, he tells them there is a presidential election every 4 years. There is no need to conduct a revolution on the streets of the city because there is a revolution at the ballot box every 4 years. And I think this is a very important moment because Hughes is saying that democratic Catholic political power is what needs to be relied upon at this moment and not street mobs.
His appeal seems to work. Or perhaps the rioters have simply spent their rage. In any case, the crowd disperses peacefully. It's all over at last. Slowly, New York clears away the ruins and begins to rebuild. The official death toll is 119, but the number may be as high as several thousand. Dozens of innocent civilians have been killed, as well as soldiers and policemen. But no one knows how many rioters have fallen in the street battles.
Families who found themselves confronted with the realization that members of their own family had been involved proceeded to take the bodies, bury them in the backyard. And one of the most striking things about the aftermath was the astonishing number of bodies that were found floating in the rivers.
Of the thousands of men, women, and children who take part in the riots, only a few hundred are ever brought to justice, and just 67 are convicted. Most receive short sentences. Local authorities are eager to put the disruption to rest. But President Lincoln is determined that the draft should proceed. The Army still needs more men. So the draft is set to resume in New York on August 19th with the support of large numbers of federal troops. This time, there is no disturbance.
The draft was successfully carried out in New York with the proviso that many of the drafted men did not go. They were replaced by substitutes who were paid for by the Common Council's $2.5 million appropriation.
Ultimately, the draft has little impact on the Union war effort. Of the 80,000 men drafted in New York State, only 2,300 end up in the Army. The rest pay their exemption fees, hire substitutes, or obtain medical excuses. Most states, like New York, will meet their quotas by encouraging voluntary enlistments. Among the volunteers are more and more African Americans eager to demonstrate their patriotism and courage. Eventually, 179,000 serve in the Union Army, many in their own regiments. 37,000 die in battle. On July 18th, just a day after the riots end, the 54th Massachusetts Colored Infantry storms Fort Wagner, a Confederate stronghold near Charleston, South Carolina. Fatally injured in the battle is Sergeant Robert Simmons, whose nephew was lynched in the New York riots 2 days earlier. For New York City's African American residents, the draft riots have a devastating and lasting impact. Besides an unknown number of dead, thousands more have fled the city, never to return.
Some were hiding in the woods of Bergen County, New Jersey, and in parts of Weeksville, a Black community in Brooklyn. The winter of 1863-64 was clearly a very hard one for Black families who had had many of their belongings and sometimes their homes destroyed in the riots.
New York's Black population has been reduced by almost a third. It will be years before the community recovers. As for the threat of competition so feared by many Irish workers, it never materializes.
The close of the Civil War and the abolition of slavery did not lead to the sudden deluge of Southern freedmen into New York. So in some ways, Northern working men's fears had been misplaced.
Many white citizens respond sympathetically to their Black neighbors, but charity can't solve the larger problems they face.
Basically, their condition didn't change a heck of a lot. They still remained at the bottom of the economic ladder as white-collar jobs, sales clerk jobs, etc., increased. Almost all of those were closed to Blacks. But on the other hand, it stimulated many others to fight for their rights and to demand equality. The riot revealed the depths of racism in the North, that this was not just a Southern problem.
The riots do help to improve one New York institution badly in need of reform.
Yeah. This is why Black, Hispanic, and Native American people should separate themselves in every way from white America. Because white America has fooled us to think that the Civil War was about the duty to free the slaves in the South, when we clearly have just learned that Abraham Lincoln did not declare or create the Emancipation Proclamation to free slaves because it was the right thing to do, the morally just thing to do, but for the pure fact that it was a strategic military move to help benefit the North in the war with the South. We clearly learned that the Irish, once they found out that the war was now about freeing Black people from the South, their disdain and hatred towards us manifests to greater heights. How they viewed us as a threat to their way of life. How the Emancipation Proclamation didn't even free every Black slave. It only would free the slaves that were in the South, not even at the borders of the North and South, or not even at sections where the North had a military stronghold. There were still slaves. But we have been hoodwinked to think that Abraham Lincoln was some great guy. He was a devil like every other devil. And the fact that the American government has ingrained and indoctrinated us the idea that he freed the slaves has been a twisted lie. That he was so great. That has been a twisted lie. This is the Israelite School of Universal Practical Knowledge, where no lies are told with the history and destruction of our people. Although the rulers of this nation and of the world would want to hide the truth and lie about the truth, we will expose and continue to expose the facts of what have happened to our people throughout the centuries. I'm Priest Shargapan of the Israelite School of Universal Practical Knowledge. Joining me today was Officer Parataza.
Yes, sir.
To all the brothers out there, Shalom, Yahweh Bashim Yashai Brokatham. To the sisters, Yahweh Shamar Alatan Bashim Yashai. This is the ISUPK Monday night history class. Shalom, Israel.